In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Crucible Knight build. This is a New Game Plus build that focuses on the use of Ordovis' Greatsword, the Crucible Axe armor, and some of the aspect of Crucible incantations. If you've been trying to figure out a way to play a Crucible Knight in Elden Ring effectively, combining the weapon, the armor, and the spells, then watch on to find out, because this build does just that. So first up, let's take a look at Ordovis' Greatsword. This is a weapon that I went over a little bit in the Greatsword's video. If you saw that video, then you'll know that this weapon is primarily a strength scaling weapon, and the faith scaling on it past about 20 is extremely poor. And if you're just trying to maximize the damage of this weapon, focusing on strength will get you far more damage than focusing on faith will. However, because we're trying to incorporate the aspect of Crucible incantations into this build, we are going to increase faith simply because there isn't a good way to get good incantation scaling without at least some faith, unless you're using the Dragon Communion Seal and you're doing an arcane build, obviously. So we need a combination of strength and faith here. So you're going to put some points in faith, which isn't exactly optimal for Ordovis' Greatsword. Ideally, you'd probably take the strength up to 80 and take faith up to like 20 or 25 in order to use Golden Vow, something like that. But you wouldn't really take it much higher than that. We're going to do that in this build because we want to use those. But I just want to point that out. If you were simply trying to make a build around this Greatsword and nothing else, you would focus primarily on strength. There have been some buffs to this weapon with patch 1.07. The first of which is that your poise damage with two-handed normal attacks with this weapon is going to be higher, meaning it's going to be easier to stagger enemies with regular R1s. You usually kill regular enemies with R1s in like one attack anyway, or maybe two. So this isn't going to play a huge part in this build, but if you were just wailing away on a boss with R1s, you'd be more likely to stagger them than previously. Another change that was added to Greatswords specifically, as well as a couple other weapon types, is that the poise of some of their attacks has been increased, meaning that if you are below that 51 poise rank point, you're still going to be able to, attack through some attacks. I don't know which attack specifically. I've not tested this out. It's not particularly important for this build because you have very high poise anyway. But just so you know, if you're playing with this weapon and you have sub 51 poise, you should still be able to tank through some attacks and get your attacks off. And then lastly, the changes to Ordovis' Vortex itself. This is the weapon skill. The attack power of it's been increased. The motion speed of it's been increased. The poise damage it deals increased. The increased poise when you're using it, so you're going to be able to tank through hits more easily. And the delay between the end of various actions and being able to perform this skill has been decreased, so you can get an attack off and then use this faster. So that's all really, really good. The attack power of this weapon skill was already really good in my opinion, but the real kicker here is the motion speed, being able to cast it faster, and also the poise damage. You're going to notice that the poise damage on this weapon skill is absolutely nutty. You can stagger a troll with one charged cast of this, just one, and it's staggered. You could go into a boss fight with Godric or another boss and do two charged casts of this ability, and they're staggered. That's insane. That means if you charge this up as an enemy or a boss is coming to you, hit them with one, dodge an attack, and do it again and poise through any attack they do, which you probably will with your armor, they're staggered. And then you could cast it again while they're on the ground, usually finishing them off or bringing them close, or then casting it again and finishing them off. So it's really deadly, this poise damage, and I don't want to understate that I think that's probably the most valuable part of this, that and the motion speed. The weapon itself deals a physical and holy damage. It deals about 2-to-1 physical to holy damage, which is okay. Holy damage is not a great damage type in this game, in my opinion. There are a lot of bosses, especially early and late game, that resist holy damage. But because you do primarily physical damage, you're going to be fine here. Additionally, the weapon skill, Ordovis' Vortex, does mostly physical damage and some holy damage. It's about the same ratio as your weapon itself. So you're going to be dealing mostly physical damage when you use this. And the incantations that we're using with this build, aspect of Crucible's Tail and the Horns, spells do physical damage, and they don't deal holy damage, which is good. And the Fire Breath spell, aspect 1, does fire damage. So you have a lot of different damage types here, very little holy damage, which is great for this build. Looking at our Sacred Seal, we're using the Clawmark Seal here because it scales off strength and faith. Our incantation scaling is 285 with the way that we're set up. There really isn't a way to get higher incantation scaling with this build with the setup that we have. If you want to deal good damage with this weapon particularly, and you want to be able to deal decent damage with your incantations, this is what you're going to use at this point. If you don't care about Ordovis' Greatsword and you're using some other weapon, you could crank Faith and use a different seal that has better Faith scaling, and you would deal more damage with these aspects of Crucible incantations. But because we are trying to kind of cosplay the Crucible Knight and fit it all together, this is the best option at the moment. Because you're going to continue to increase strength and faith with this build, this is going to be your best option for quite some time, probably all the way through New Game Plus. If you're taking this build into New Game Plus, you will probably hit a faith point at some point where another Sacred Seal would outperform the incantation scaling of this one. Because this one caps out lower than other seals that are pure faith. So there may be one that's better. You'd have to check and see in New Game Plus. But for the moment, this is the best option. We have the Crucible Axe armor here. This gives us fantastic protection. If you're using Golden Vow with this and you have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman equipped, you have about 50% physical protection, which is absolutely nutty. That means half the damage you take from a physical attack is going to be reduced, which is really, really good. And it allows you to just survive pretty much anything, which is awesome. The other reason we use this armor set, a couple of reasons actually, is High Poise. This allows you to pull off your weapon skill or Ordovus' Vortex and your regular attacks without getting staggered, which is great. These, again, already have some hyper armor on them, so it's not necessary, but it's also good. And then also, you get 3.5% increased damage with these aspect incantations for each piece of armor you're wearing from this set. So wearing all of these, that's like a 15-ish, 14-ish% increase roughly to those spells. And we need all the damage increase to these we can get because our incantation scaling is not as high as like a pure faith build would be. That's, of course, not taking into account the cosplay of the build. When it comes to talismans for this build, there's 3 that I pretty much use constantly, and then I have like a flex spot. So I have Shard of Alexander to increase Ordovus' Vortex damage, no brainer. Godfrey Icon, this increases the damage of Ordovus' Vortex when you charge it, which you really should if you can. And also, all 3 aspect of Crucible incantations are chargeable, so you get increased damage to them if you charge them up, which is also great. And then you have the Phlox Canvas Talisman, which increases the damage of your incantations. And again, you need all the damage you can get with these because our incantation scaling is not as high as I would probably like, or some pure faith or pure caster builds would be at this point. When it comes to the flex spot, there are so many great options you can use. Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, as I suggested, gives you enough physical protection that you have 50% protection when Golden Vow is up. It's a great option. The Claw Talisman is not bad if you're doing jump attacks. This will give you really, really good jump attack damage, which is fantastic. The Ritual Sword Talisman is also not a bad choice if you're not getting hit very much, although I tend to play really aggressive, so I don't use it much. But that would increase your damage with weapon attacks, Ordovus' Vortex, and your incantations. It's a good way to get more incantation damage because there are only so many ways you can do that in this game. And there are other good options too, like Taker's Cameo. That ability or talisman will give you health back whenever you kill an enemy. Or even the Ancestral Spirit Horn giving you FP back whenever you kill an enemy. You kill lots of enemies with your AoEs in this. You have lots of AoEs, so it's a good way to get health back or FP back, whichever you're struggling to keep up. You can use any of these, and you can switch them around on the fly. For instance, if you're using Taker's Cameo or Ancestral Spirit Horn and you're in a boss fight, those aren't going to help you. So you can put the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman on there, or you can put Ritual Sword Talisman on there and switch these up as necessary. Another one that I really want to mention too for this build is either Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Wing Sword Insignia, or Millicent's Prosthesis, either of these 3. And I'll get into why that is here in just a minute, but those 3 are also not a bad option in your flex spot. So moving along to the spells, we have Golden Vow, of course, to increase all of our damage, weapon attacks, weapon skills, spells, which is great, and our defenses. And then we have Flame Grant Me Strength. Because the weapon damage that you deal is mostly physical, this is a good choice. The aspect of Crucible's Horn and Tail both deal physical damage, and the Breath one deals fire damage, so this buffs all 3 of those, so it's a great addition to this build as well. Moving along to the aspects of the Crucible incantations, let's start with Tail first. This is the first one you get in the game, so I'll just start there. This thing does like a sweeping AoE that kind of hits in an AoE around you, mostly in front of you. It doesn't seem to hit behind you very well. In my testing, it sometimes does, but not all the time. And if you charge it up, it deals even more damage. And it's a rather large AoE. It's not the largest AoE I've seen in the game, but it's a pretty good size. It's bigger than Ordovus' Vortex. And in my opinion, the reason to use this spell is if you're using one of the 3 talismans I just mentioned, either Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Winged Sword Insignia, or Millicent's Prosthesis, because hitting enemies with this spell will actually trigger these talismans. So it's a fantastic way to boost your attack power really quickly when you have a pack of enemies. Ordovus' Vortex does not do this. If you hit like a group of 8 enemies with Ordovus' Vortex, it counts as 1 hit. And then if you cast it again and hit 8 enemies, it'll count as 2 hits, and you'll trigger the talisman. You'll have effectively triggered the very first tier. However, if you cast aspects of Crucible's Tail and hit 7 enemies or 8 enemies, you get 8 hits. and that are counted as, melee attacks or whatever, you know what I mean, attacks in the game. So this is a really great way to trigger those, and it's really only useful, in my opinion, or mostly useful if you're going to use those talismans. So if you get to a part of the game and you see a lot of enemies up ahead, or there's going to be a lot of enemies and you're going to want to AoE, you're going to want to throw on one of those talismans in the flex spot and then use this to build up your attack power really quickly. You could use this and then lead into Ordovus' Vortex for even further damage, or you can just cast it again, build up your attack power higher, or deal even more damage with it the second cast. It's really good. And you want to make sure you charge it if possible, because that will increase the damage not only from Godfrey Icon, but also from the ability itself, giving you even more damage. I also want to mention as well that the FP cost of this spell has gone down slightly with patch 1.07, and the stamina attack power against guarded enemies has gone up. So enemies blocking with the shield when you hit them with this are going to take more stamina damage. Next up, we have aspects of the Crucible Horns. What this does is it sort of charges forward with, like, you summon a horn in front of you and you lower your shoulder and charge in and deal damage, physical damage. And then if you charge it, you'll go even further and deal even more poise damage. So you want to charge it if you can. Obviously, you're going to get that damage from Godfrey Icon increase as well if you do that. So you want to try and charge it if you can. But what I really like to use this for is for tough enemies and bosses when you're fighting like a single lone enemy. Because very rarely can you just walk up to a boss or a tough enemy and just use Ordovus' Vortex. Like, they're just not going to let you do that a lot of times. So what I like to do is I like to cast this spell instead. And what this lets me do is it lets me get into range, deal damage at the same time, knock an enemy up in the air sometimes, interrupt them, or, kind of make them flinch sometimes. And then if I cast it again while they're sort of flinched, a lot of times I can make them flinch again, or I can knock them up into the air again, or I can stagger them. And then when they're staggered, you can use Ordovus' Greatsword and absolutely devastate them when they're kind of helpless. And it's a really, really good combo. The spell itself doesn't deal a ton of damage. It's not a very high damaging spell, and obviously our incantation scaling is not like the greatest in the world right now. But what it's really good for is gap closing and staggering, and it's really, really good in one-on-one scenarios, and it sets you up nicely for Ordovus' Greatsword a lot of the time. You can absolutely bully the Crucible Knight himself using this incantation, so I highly, highly recommend it. Also, I do want to note that it has also had its FP cost reduced with patch 1.07 and its stamina attack power increased, meaning it will, deal more stamina damage to enemies guarding. Last up, we have Aspect of the Crucible Breath. This spell deals fire damage in a cone periodically as you walk forward, and if you charge it up, you'll just do this even longer, and it'll cost you even more FP. Again, it's good to do because it takes advantage of the Godfrey Icon, just like the other incantations. But what's really great about the spell is it deals fire damage. So, you have a different damage type. You have physical damage with the spell, you have some holy damage, though not a lot, and you have fire damage. So you got another damage type option here, which is really, really good. And one really cool thing about this is that it can cause constant flinching with enemies. Certain enemies, depending on how much poise they have, will just constantly flinch if you cast this on them. And you can just do it over and over and just body them. Like the Leona Misbegotten boss, for instance. If you cast this on him while he's not in an animation that has high poise, he literally won't be able to get out of it or even get to you. So you can just bully some enemies and bosses with it, and it's a lot of fun to do. But you'll have to practice using it and see what enemy types you can use it on and not, to know when it's most efficient to use this, because you have a lot of AoEs with this build, and sometimes it's not always the best choice. When it comes to stats for this build, we have 50 Vigor, 26 Mind, 31 Endurance, 55 Strength, 13 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 45 Faith, and 9 Arcane. You don't need any Intelligence and Arcane for this build, just because of my class is why we have those. So if you have a different class to start with, your stat spread will look a little bit better at level 166 than I am. 50 Vigor is there to give you health to trade blows. You do that a lot with this build, charging up Ordovus' Vortex or using some of the spells charged up. You will take hits when using these, and this will keep you alive. You have really good protection with this build. You probably don't need higher than 50 Vigor for this build, but you could take it up to 60 at some point if you just want to be even more survivable. Mind is at 26 here. This is a bit lower than I want at this point. You go through a lot of FP between buffing with Golden Vow, using Ordovus' Vortex, using your spells. You're constantly going to be chugging blue pots with this level of mind. So getting this up to 35, 40 would be ideal in the long run. And as you go through NG+, you should definitely increase mind to probably 30 right away before you further increase your damage. 31 Endurance is just enough equip load to medium roll with this build. If you are using a different weapon or different armor sets, etc., your equip load can, vary a little bit. But if you want the exact equip load for what we're using here, that's what you need in order to be able to pull that off. We have 55 strength here for Ordovis' Greatsword and also the Clawmark Seal, but Ordovis' Greatsword starts to peter off a bit, about 53, 54 strength right in that area. So I wanted to halt there and get Faith up in order to keep our incantation scaling, relatively good. If you were just focusing on Ordovis' Greatsword, you would probably crank this thing up to 80 and just keep Faith at 25 to buff with Golden Vow, and you could just, spam Ordovis' Greatsword and probably be fine. But I wanted the whole shebang with the Crucible Knight, so that's why we waited there and took Faith up to 45 instead. 13 Dexterity is there just to meet the requirements of Ordovis' Greatsword. You will get some damage out of this. I don't recommend putting points here anytime soon because of the way this build is kind of shaping up. But theoretically, if you got Strength to 80 and Faith to 80, you could take up Dexterity to further increase the damage of this build if you kept playing into NG++ and beyond. 45 Faith is the soft cap for the Clawmark Seal, and going much above this doesn't yield any really good results for incantation scaling with this seal. So you sort of need to make a decision what you want to do moving forward with this. Do you want to prioritize strength, which will give you some incantation scaling with the Clawmark Seal, give you good damage for Ordovis' Greatsword and Ordovis' Vortex, or would you prefer to focus on Faith and maybe get to like 60 or 70 Faith, getting you a little damage with Ordovis' Greatsword and Ordovis' Vortex, but allowing you to swap out the seal to get better incantation scaling with maybe another seal like the Erdtree Seal. So that's really up to you which direction you want to go. You can bring them up both together and eventually swap out the Sacred Seal for a different one, but you really need to make a decision which direction you want to go here. And just a couple final tips before I wrap up this video. If you're using the Flask of Wonders Physique, I recommend using the Poise Damage tier. This will give you even more poise damage with this build. It's very easy to stagger bosses and enemies with these spells and Ordovis' Vortex. If you use this, it's just going to be even easier, so that's not a bad one to have. Also, the fire damage tier is also good if you're using the Fire Breath spell. Otherwise, it's not very good. You could use the holy damage one if you're using Ordovis' Vortex, because that will further boost the holy damage of that. It's not a ton. Other options are like strength or faith in order to give you more damage with your spells and to give you more damage with your weapon. You don't really use too many other ones. You can use stamina recovery as well if you want, because you tend to chew through stamina. But it really depends on like what strategy you're going for, what boss. You kind of swap these around. If you're looking at using a Great Rune for this build, Godric's is probably the best choice because you need Vigor, you need Mind, you need Endurance, you need Strength, you need some Dexterity, and you need Faith. So 6 of the 8 stats you need some of. That I think anytime you need 5 or 6 stats, it makes a good case for Godric's Great Rune. So that's what I recommend using here. One other thing that I want to mention too is that you can use Soluria's Tree Spear and the other Crucible armor if you'd rather sort of cosplay that build. The stat spread is almost exactly the same if you want to use the aspect of Crucible incantations. And this thing has an absolutely deadly weapon skill as well in Soluria's Woe that was also buffed in patch 1.07. This thing hits like an absolute truck from downtown. So you can 2-shot some bosses with this, maybe 3-shot some bosses. So you're not locked into the Ordovis' Greatsword, and the stat spread would be roughly the same if you want to use this weapon instead or in addition to this build. So that wraps up our Crucible Knight build. We have more builds coming. I know you guys are looking forward to the weapon guides. I fortunately didn't get the Straight Swords video done this week. I had a crazy amount of streaming going on in Twitch, and I got very little sleep. So I didn't have a lot of time to work on that video. The weapon videos take a lot more time to test and go through the details than the build videos. But I do want to keep getting out Elden Ring build videos and weapon videos, so you can keep looking forward to those. Hopefully I'll have the Straight Swords video out next week for you. And again, if you have build suggestions of what you would like to see, please leave them in the comments. One of the reasons I decided to do the Dragon Scale Blade and I decided to do the Crucible Knight is I saw people asking for them.